So Tuesdays is our meditation as refuge. That's Zoom only, 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. Lorraine Jabola will be teaching this one. On Wednesdays, we have our Just Sit. That's a peer-led meditation class on Zoom. That's 5:30 p.m. to 6:15. And Rule Young is going to be teaching our loving kindness meditation on Friday, 4:30 to 5:15 p.m. on Zoom. I did want to mention a change about our Sunday meetings. We've been doing our hybrid meeting where we have in person and on Zoom offered. We're just trying to make sure that we can meet our what we want to offer and what we're able to offer. So right now we're going to be pulling back a little bit on the in-person offering for Sundays. It'll always be available on Zoom, of course, so you'll be able to tune in on Zoom and watch. But we're going to be doing once a month in person. Will be the third Sunday of the month where you can come and join us. Be here at the UUCOD facility that we are renting, and join us in person or on Zoom. And it'll always be available on Zoom as well. That's just us trying to find some balance there. Hopefully, that's temporary. That is the hope on our end, of course. I also wanted to mention that there are spaces open for or pardon me, Damadina is hosting a um, a residential retreat, October 24th to November 24th. That is going to be called Holding Each Moment with Wisdom and Love. It's a residential retreat with Leslie Booker, Arena Wiseman, and Ian Chalice. This is for the queer community, and there are specifically spaces available for self-identified people of color in the queer community. So if you know somebody or are somebody who'd be interested in that, please go to our newsletter, go to our webpage, or go to Damadina's webpage, and you can join there. One thing I did want to bring up, I'll be attending there, and I know it's a 2 week retreat. It seems like a long time, but you can choose to do just the first week or the second week. Not everybody can swing 2 weeks in a row, so that is something to keep in mind as well. With that, I will leave you to Mary. Mary.
Thanks so much, Adrienne. I appreciate that. And hi, everyone. It's good to see you. I had, Adrienne mentioned it was a last minute change. I usually come out to UU to the desert to do the class, but unfortunately my husband was in the hospital this week and he got out today, and so it was impossible to manage that and to drive out to the desert. But as Adrienne said, I'm grateful that we have the technology to do both. And in fact, yesterday we thought he was getting out yesterday, and it kept getting later and later. And I teach a 5 o'clock class every Saturday afternoon, and I got to do my class yesterday from the beautiful spaciousness of his bathroom in his hospital room. So this is a little bit nicer. So I also got a note that my internet is a bit unstable. So for the meditation, I'm going to turn my video off, and hopefully it'll straighten itself out by the end of that, in case, so there's no lag or freezing. And we're not looking at each other during meditation anyway. So without further ado, I'm going to move into our practice, where we're going to sit together for about 40 minutes. And let yourselves move into this practice, finding your seat, whatever that might be. Whether you're sitting or standing or lying down, allow yourself to settle in, to arrive, letting your mind and your body arrive. So often the body is still, but the mind is going and going and going. So allow the mind to still as well by releasing all the thoughts or expectations you might have for this afternoon, for tomorrow, for anything. Releasing the memories as well. Giving yourself the gift of these moments just to be. We're so often human doings rather than human beings. So these moments of intentional sitting, of stillness, are quite lovely, quite a gift. So as you move into this steadiness in the moment, allow the body to relax, releasing any tightness or tension that you might be holding. Releasing the constriction that we often carry without realizing it. Maybe even taking a few moments to do a simple scan of the body and release as you move through, perhaps beginning at the top of the head, relaxing around the face, the jaw, allowing the shoulders to relax. So much is carried in the shoulders, so much tension. Letting them release, moving on from the shoulders down into the arms and the hands, whether they rest on your lap or your legs. Allowing the torso to relax, softening where you can, chest, the belly, the hips, the back. We each carry emotions and thoughts in many different pockets, allowing them to release where you can, moving down into the legs, thighs, the calves, the feet. Imagine a letting go of anything you're holding, just releasing. And with that release, perhaps noticing the breath, the body as it breathes, gentle movement of the inhale and the exhale. allowing yourself to be held by the foundation beneath you, the seat, the chair, the floor, ultimately the earth. There's nothing for you to do, nothing to accomplish, resting right here, open to whatever arrives, to whatever is present. Aware of the sensations in the body, aware of the other sense experiences. There may be sound, maybe sight, maybe smell. Open in awareness to these, and also recognizing there's no need to react to anything. Something may be pleasant, something may be unpleasant. Allow yourself to be open to whatever arises, whatever's right here. Recognize that even with the intention to, it's so easy for the mind to drift, to become entangled in thought. The habits of the mind are strong, the stories are so seductive, pulling us into the future, the past. You do find yourself drifting away or caught up in a thought. Make the effort to release, to return to the present time awareness. There's nowhere else to be but right here. As much as the mind travels, you can always return. Allow this entire practice to be held in a container of kindness, gentleness. So easy to become judgmental, critical if the mind wanders. We can't stay still. Instead, just recognizing that right now this is the experience, restless mind, unpleasant sensation, whatever it is, can you greet it and be with? The invitation of the practice is to rest in gentle awareness, open to whatever is present, and releasing any craving, wishing it were different, that something would happen or not happen. Instead, can you be with what's right here? Sound, physical sensation, a thought, an emotion, without needing it to be different. Allowing your body and mind to rest and relax right here. Now it is like this. Releasing, relaxing the body, releasing any tension that may have built up. Even while sitting, there's unpleasant experiences or thoughts or emotions, it's easy to react with tension. So allow the body to relax, allow the mind to relax, resting again in gentle awareness of this moment, this breath. Relaxing the body, relaxing the mind, letting yourself rest in this awareness of this moment, releasing the future, releasing the past, releasing the stories, resting here with gentleness, with kindness. nowhere else to be. There's only right here, right now. Nothing to do. So let yourself be open, aware, yet steady, even if only for a moment, even if only for a breath, finding that stillness that's always available. We are coming to the last few moments of our sit this afternoon. And the invitation, if you like, is to spend a moment in a gratitude practice, reflecting on something in your life you're grateful for and resting in that gratitude. Thanks, everyone. Any questions or comments about the instructions or your experience in the meditation? Okay. To get my notes out from underneath the cat. Gone to sleep on them. So you probably know that during the month of August, each Sunday we're talking about how to work with difficult emotions, and it's actually going to go on to the first Sunday in September. So it'll be a whole series on this. And today I'm talking about grief and loss. How do we work with grief and loss? And it's always helpful. And I think, especially right now, there's so much grief, there's so much loss, there's so much sorrow. And it's really challenging or difficult, or we're unsure of how to work with it, And I think I have learned everything I know about dealing with grief, about being present with grief and sadness and sorrow and loss through this practice, through my practice, and through the teachings, not just grief and sorrow, but most emotions. I was fairly clueless most of my life on how to deal with emotions, and found a whole bunch of other ways of not dealing with them. And so it's really, really helpful. And we may have, right now there are challenges at the mic. Excuse me, there's a cat pulling my camera back. So right now we're dealing both at the macro level with grief, especially the last couple of years. I mean, grief, there's always grief at a larger level beyond our personal lives. Things, there's so much violence in the world. There's so much tragedy. And then the pandemic offered a tremendous amount of loss. So much was going on, so many lost lives, so much grief, so much loss, including the normalcy, quote unquote, of our lives before. Even looking at this sangha, it's totally changed in the last couple of years, and how to deal with the emotions that come up with that. It's really challenging. And so there's the macro level, and then there's the micro level of the losses we're dealing with in our own lives, and our own grief and sadness and sorrow from any number of reasons. And often when we talk about grief, we think about grief from a death of a loved one, or some kind of death. And but there's all kinds of grief and loss. There's the loss of a relationship, there's a loss of a job, there's a loss of normalcy, there's a loss of anything can be a loss, depending on our relationship to it. And so how do we hold all those emotions? And if you look at the early texts, the suttas, the Pali Canon, the Buddha talks about grief and loss, specifically in the First Noble Truth, the Noble Truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. Union, being coupled with what is displeasing, is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not getting what we want is suffering. There's so much suffering. It's basically the human condition, and that First Noble Truth translates into the 5 remembrances. We are of the nature to grow old, get sick, and die. Everything we have will be taken from us. All we have are our actions. And so this loss is right there in the First Noble Truth. It's right there in the 5 remembrances that we're invited to reflect on. So it's acknowledged as part of life. There is this loss. But also in the early canon, especially in some conversations between Ananda and Sariputta about grief and loss, and they're both the attendants and to the Buddha. Ananda is not enlightened, Sariputta is, and talking about what to do, what might happen when the Buddha dies. And Sariputta says, You should not, and a lot of the suttas say, do not grieve, nor should you lament, because what good is gained? Even even if we lose the teacher, the Buddha, you know, there would arise in me no sorrow, no lamentation, no pain or distress or despair. Still, I would have thought, what a great being of great might, of great prowess has disappeared. So instead of being saddened, there would be this gratitude for the greatness, this experience that we had with this wonderful teacher. And that's a challenging concept. That's a challenging idea. And it can sometimes morph into this idea of spiritual bypass. I have seen this a lot of times where people take these teachings, like this teaching of no lamentation, it's all part of life. It's like this shoulder shrugging. Oh, well, you know, as an intellectual way to avoid feeling. I see that time and time again with the teaching around impermanence. Oh, well, everything ends, which, this is impermanence, this grief, loss, sorrow. It's all around the idea of impermanence. And, at some point, we will get to a place in, I mean, that's the intention. At some point, if I become enlightened, it would be nice. I'm not there yet, so I don't know what this feels like. We will be at that place of non-attachment to anything, what's called the deathless, where we can experience the full picture, recognizing there is loss without any clinging. But I don't think any of us are there yet. I don't think any of us are there yet. So instead of being demoralized by these old teachings, I want to couple it with the other ideas around what happened. What happened back in the time of the Buddha. Some of you are familiar with the poems of the early Buddhist nuns. And there is one poem. I'm taking this one from the book The First Free Women, which is a reimagining of the poems, which are part of the Pali Canon. And so these are, just as old as much of the discourses of the Buddha. And this is a poem from a nun, Vasetti, and it says, when a child dies, everyone grieves, but a mother's grief is different. No more real or more important, just different. I can talk about it like this now. Back then, I just wandered from place to place. I don't know if I ate. I don't know if I slept. From the bottom of that darkness, I heard a voice. It was just a whisper. So I leaned towards it and became a bucket pulled slowly up from the bottom of a well. In the same way, I called out to my grief and drew it towards me. I held my grief and gently rocked it. Shh, I said. There, 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 there. People sometimes ask, wasn't it painful? Weren't you afraid? Yes, it was painful. So is giving birth. Oh, my heart, you mustn't fear the pain. So at the same time as the Buddha was, and the teachings were to no lamentations, no despair, there's also the acknowledgement of what grief is like, the pain, the fear, the deep hurt, the longing. As she said, she wandered from place to place, which is very similar to the one sutta, Kisagotami, very famous, the woman whose child died, and she went everywhere asking people for medicine to help cure her dead child, bring it back to life, and everyone took pity on her and said, we can't, it's impossible. And she eventually found the Buddha, who said, sure, I can help you, but bring me a mustard seed from the house in the village that has never experienced death. And she went from house to house to house to house, of course. And she said, "Do you have a mustard seed?" And they said, "Yes." And she said, "Have you ever experienced death?" And they said, "No." And she eventually realized that this is part of the human condition. And instead of fighting against it, because this is also one of the basic teachings of the Buddha, instead of fighting against it, instead of whatever mechanisms we use to not feel or to change what's happening, the loss, the sadness, the grief, the invitation instead is to recognize this is part of what life is all about. There is loss. The first noble truth, there is separation from things we love. This is part of it. How do we hold it? How do we work with it? No, we don't fight it. We accept it, recognizing it. And then there's this, I'm also heartened by some of the Mahayana teachings, which I think this falls into. A lot of things fall into this, the idea of two truths, of absolute versus relative. There's the absolute awareness of awakening that Sariputta is talking about. No lamentations, just great gratitude for this wonderful teacher because he's no longer attached to anything. But we're not there. We're not arhats yet. We're not enlightened. I'm not. I shouldn't speak for you, but I'm guessing you're probably not yet. And that these emotions do impact you as they impact me. So instead, recognizing there's the relative experience of our day-to-day lives where we go through life and things happen and we feel what's going on. I mean, lately I've been extremely sensitive. I may have talked about this the last time. I think I talked about this the last time I was at in Rancho Mirage at the church a couple of Sundays ago, or a few Sundays ago, that I've just kind of been so sensitive. I was hiking and a deer ran across the trail in front of me, and I'm like in the foothills of Los Angeles. I'm not anywhere far away, and just ran across, and I started just crying, just not really a lot of sobbing, but just welled up with emotion, allowing that to be there, allowing those experiences to be present are what this practice is inviting us to do. And for me, has enabled me to connect with, to get in touch with. There's a wonderful teacher, Frank Ostaseski, who's worked with death and dying, and he talks about grief. And he says, we may think of grief as a solid thing that will eclipse our life, or a black hole that we will fall into and never escape. Our tendency for self-protection leads us to store the conflicting emotions of grief in some dark, cramped corner of the mind or body. But avoidance or resistance to grief only intensifies the pain. It's like resistance to anything intensifies it. Like I was at the grocery store this morning and I was putting the groceries in the trunk of my car, and I had lifted the trunk, but apparently I hadn't lifted it enough, and I went like this and slammed my head into the corner of the trunk. That's yeah, I have a nice little lump. That smarts. And in the olden days, before I was really into practice, it could have got into that place of go away. Excuse me, cat attack. Sorry. Gotten into that place of you dummy, what would you do that for? And or the contraction, always the contraction around the pain. Fight it, fight it, fight it. But that intensifies it. Instead, it was like, okay, be with, feel the sensations throughout the body, feel the throbbing. Okay, just need to be still for a few moments. Okay. And feel it and be with it without any of those extra, the second arrow and the third arrow and the fourth arrow of why did this happen and why did I do that? And because I have been in my life prone to self-criticism, self-judgment. If it's uncomfortable, obviously I did something wrong. If I were only better, it wouldn't hurt, which is false. It is what it is, what it is. And so when we avoid anything, feeling pain in our bodies, feeling emotions. There's a tremendous, it intensifies it. So the invitation is to be with the grief, be with the loss, be with the sorrow. How do we touch into that? And each of us are at very different places with this. And so much of this, because we're conditioned beings, so much of this, how our relationship to grief is how we learn to deal with it growing up, either in our family of origin and or in the people we um, hung out with or were influenced by. And my giving my example, I wasn't taught anything. I was in a chaplaincy training years ago, and the teacher was one of the presenters was asking us, how did you learn to deal with loss as growing up? And a lot of it was get over it, not necessarily out loud, but implied. My father died when I was 5. He had a stroke and he was taken to the hospital. And I think it was just a few days later, my mom made dinner for me and my brother, who's like 11 years older than I was. And she said, your dad's dead or died or whatever she said, and he's not coming home anymore. And that was it. And then we had dinner. And that was it. Um, as a 5-year-old, I had no idea about emotions or how to deal with them, and it became intellectual. Like if I was in class and it's like, okay, today we're making Father's Day cards, and I'd go up to the teacher and I'd say, I don't have a father, and she's like, okay, you do this. It was up here. I didn't know, it was not connected to my experience. There was no experience around that. And that's how I dealt with most things. Try to think my way out of having to feel that. I was not really, I doubt if my mom knew how to deal with stuff. Looking back, I know she didn't know how to deal with stuff. So I didn't learn how to deal with anything. And I just dealt with it the best I could. Sex and drugs and rock and roll and candy bars and potato chips and whatever there was to have me not feel. And by the time I began formal practice, I was kind of a mess. I'd felt I'd hit a brick wall one more time in my life. I was just really, you know, a lot of unease, a lot of dissatisfaction with the world I was living in, without a clue on how to move forward. I knew something wasn't right, but I was clueless. I had tried meditation over the years, but nothing stuck. I don't think I sat with a teacher formally, although I tried different classes and I read some books. I loved Pema Chodron. I loved her stuff. It just resonated so much with me. But when I finally found a teacher, or I found a class who was teaching mindfulness, Vipassana, and I first began to sit and I began to see that I didn't have to follow the mind all the time, but instead I could slow down and turn towards what was inside. The first stuff that came up, I'm talking like 40, 45 years later, was about my father's death. Was this stuff that had been hanging out my whole life that I didn't know anything about. There was a huge wall between me and the grief because my world turned upside down. Everything shifted, everything changed. And I was just like, what do I do? I don't know. I don't even know to ask these questions because I'm 5 years old. So the practice of sitting with what is present and making the effort to let go of the thinking that takes me away from the feeling. How do I feel? How do I sit still and be with this? So often the fear of feeling is greater than the actual feeling, the actual experience of what is happening. The grief that was there, the sadness, the loss, the mourning. Because when there's grief, there's often mourning for what has been lost. And we have to honor that. There's a couple of books by a man named William Bridges. One is called Transitions, and the other is called The Way of Transition. And he talks about how everything ends. It's not Buddhist, but it's sure, it's got that, speaks very much to the Buddhist ideals that, or ideas that everything ends. But we are all about getting on to the next thing, getting over it, moving forward, getting what's next, what's next, what's next, that we ignore the transition, what has to happen. And at a macro level, we're in transition. We're trying to, okay, it's normal again, it's normal again, it's normal again. It's like, yeah, no, we're still on that, who knows where we are, but we're not there because there's no there. And with so many things, it's like, let me honor what has happened. Let me honor the mourning. There's in the grief, there's one of the stories he tells in the book Transitions is about a woman, a couple who were having a baby, and very happy about it, very, very wanted this, planned it, were very excited, and the child was born, everything was great, but she fell into this, I don't know if it was a depression, but what it was. And what in working with him, with Bridges, she realized that she had not mourned the ending of her prior life, even though they were really looking forward to the new life. There was a total disregard for the ending of her entire life up until that point. Everything is changing. Everything is changing. So how do we honor that? Jack Kornfield, in his book, The Art of Forgiveness, Loving Kindness, and Peace, talks about grief. And he says, grief is one of the heart's natural responses to loss. It's a natural response. When we grieve, we allow ourselves to feel the truth of our pain, the measure of betrayal or tragedy in our life. By our willingness to mourn, we slowly acknowledge, integrate, and accept the truth of our losses. Sometimes the best way to let go is to grieve. And it takes courage. It really takes courage. It's about, I talk about living with the undefended heart, and it's about, that moving towards equanimity, being present with whatever is here, being present with grief, being present with joy. And one of my favorite definitions of that is a deep intimacy with our experience without preference. So the invitation is to an intimacy with grief without preference. And it takes courage because the mind is full of these ideas of what it's going to be like. I think it was Dostoevsky who said we're afraid we're going to fall into this black hole and we'll never get out of it. But my experience with it has been, and I remember working with a teacher a number of years ago where there was some emotion there was some experience in my body. I think it was this something in my gut or my chest. That's where a lot of my emotions show up, in my chest or my belly. And she was saying, what does it look like? What does it feel like? Does it have a texture, a color, etc.? Getting out of the mind and really turning towards the experience of the body. And she said, what do you think it is? And whatever emotion it was, let me say it was grief. I don't remember the specific example of that moment. So say it was grief, and it's like, oh, grief. And then the story kicks in about, but I'm feeling, and this, or whatever, and this is why, the talking, trying to talk my way out of the feeling. And she kept saying, no preference, come back, no preference, be with. That's the part that takes courage. And that's the part that takes time. We don't get this overnight. We have to put our toe in the water and then come back. with my working with grief and working with other things, and not just with the death of my father, but so many other things in my life that I didn't know how to deal with that would come up from time to time. A lot of times on retreat, because when you're on a retreat, you have that long period to really um, drop in. The other thing that comes along with this willingness to be present for our deepest experience is that it's held with kindness, it's held with compassion, it's held with gentleness. That's so important. And this also comes from the early texts where the Buddha said we rest with a mind imbued with loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity, so we can hold whatever's there. But we have to be willing to let go of the story. We have to be willing to be fully present with whatever the experience is. Um, Bell Hooks has so many beautiful things that she says. She says, what is it? To be loving, talking about being loving, to be loving, open, not armored, living with an undefended heart. To be loving is to be open to grief, to be touched by sorrow, even sorrow that's unending. We have to just be willing to be with what is. I was talking about this in my class yesterday evening, and there's a woman in that class who's just experienced the loss of a partner. And she talked about it. She shared that, it comes and then it goes, and then it comes and it goes. And that's been my experience with grief. It comes and it goes, but we're present for it when it's there. So often, it seems that there's a time limit on our grief. And I remember this when my brother died, and talking to my sister-in-law, she would get the sense that when people would ask her how she was doing, this is maybe 6 months after he died, they'd be, kind of not wanting to hear that it was still difficult, because they didn't want to deal with how she was feeling. And so we have these kinds of things these relationships that we maneuver. And so just to recognize that if it shows up, it shows up. Like Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the seeds of consciousness. These emotions are planted, and when the conditions are right, they blossom, they bloom. And maybe there's a blossoming of grief, maybe there's a blossoming of joy and happiness. But what we don't do is say, no, I'm not going to feel you. I don't want to feel you. I'm going to intellectualize my way out of this, as I like to do, or have a tendency to do. So it's really important to recognize that, as always, it's to be with. How can we be with the grief, the sadness, the loss? Right now, my husband, I mentioned he was in the hospital and he just got out today, and he's had a year, a pretty crappy year. He's had one health thing after another, and he had surgery a couple of weeks ago, and that's kind of like the last part of this year-long thing. But he's also kind of afraid, because he's worried about his diminished capacity to do different things. And our life that existed a year ago is very different. Things we used to do, we can't do anymore because of his limited abilities, or because he's got surgery or chemo or something going on. And it's like, okay, how do we hold that? There's a lot of grief around that. There's a lot of mourning around that. And to recognize it actually hangs out. It's not, loud and screaming. It's just there, and to acknowledge that it's there. I always say I have a couch kind of off my left shoulder, and I just invite the emotions to have a seat, and we just go about our business. Hi, you're there. And so it can be part of life. It doesn't have to be a final thing. It can be an ongoing thing. Just little, like I said, there's the macro level and then there's the micro level. And to be open to it and to acknowledge it and realize it's part of the human condition. I spent a lot of my life running from it, and it finally caught up with me, and I'm grateful I found this practice as well. So it's like, oh yeah, the human condition. Hello, happy to meet you. So thank you, my friends, for your generous attention, and I'm happy to see if there's any questions or comments, and perhaps if anyone would like to share how they deal with grief or how the practice has helped in any way with grief and loss in any realm. Happy to hear that. So you can raise your hand or jump in. Thank you again, my friends, for your really sweet presence. And again, I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there if there's anybody at the church. A reminder that there's a whole bunch of classes. Sunday, we're continuing next week with difficult emotions, and I think the list is on the website. And then there's the Tuesday class, the Wednesday sit, the Friday meta group. So there's a lot of stuff happening at ICD. And if you'd like to be more involved, we're always happy to welcome volunteers for any number of different things. And that your financial support is also appreciated. Adrian has put a link for the Donna in the chat to help with the support of the rent and the support of the teachers and the support of the organization. So your generosity is also lovely. And Adrian, was there anything else? Did I miss anything?
That's about it. Don't forget the YouTube.
Don't
We're
forget the
doing
YouTube. Yeah.
YouTube now. Yeah.
Wonderful,
We're
wonderful.
excited
Tell your
about
friends.
it. Yeah. Yep. You'll
Tell your
pretty much always see last week's before the next week.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. And please excuse my cat. He has no manners. And remembering that we practice not only for our benefit, but for the benefit of all beings. May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free. Thank you, my friends, and I will see you soon, I hope. Bye.